You know, we are finishing this evening with the last two chapters of the book of Esther. And this is the end of the historical books. Historical books go from Joshua all the way through Esther. And of course, the first 5 books of the Bible are called the books of Moses, or the Pentateuch. Then you have the historical books, and then you have the poetical books. So this is the last 2 chapters of the historical books. Esther chapter 9, verse 1 through Esther chapter 10, verse 3. In the state of New York, it's illegal to speak to a person while riding in an elevator, and you must fold your hands while looking forward. And this piece of legislation has apparently taken hold throughout the country without the necessity of enforcement. But it is one of the blue laws in New York. Within 4 hours of eating garlic, a person may not enter a movie house, theater, or ride a public streetcar in Gary, Indiana. Of course, they don't have any streetcars there any longer. A law is necessary in any well-ordered society. It's one of the great stabilizing influences among people and nations. Our own country governs by laws established under the broader guidance of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, as long as we can keep enough Supreme Court justices in there that believe in the Constitution anymore. But if laws are not grounded in general principles, if they just address a current crisis or narrow concern, they become either ludicrous or counterproductive. Throughout the book of Esther, King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, confronted each new situation by the issuance of a decree, whether it was the resolution of marital defiance, the amount of wine to serve at a banquet, or the wholesale annihilation of a people, genocide of the Jews. Principle gave way to imperial whim. Values were subordinated to personal feelings and ambitions. Now, this approach to governance allowed 2 opposing edicts to be issued to take effect on the same day, the 13th day of the 12th month of the year. And this lack of responsible leadership allowed the crises and the bloodshed of Adar, or December the 13th. The 12th month of the Jewish year was Adar. So first there was the deliverance of the Jews, the dawn of change. Esther chapter 9, verse 1 and 2. Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put into execution, and the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. The Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to lay hand on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, for fear of them fell upon all people. So the Jews prepare themselves for the attack. The king's new decree is protecting them, so they get everything ready to defend themselves. It's interesting to note that Herodotus, the Greek historian, records that Ahasuerus, Xerxes I, returned home after his defeat in the Greek campaign about 480 BC, and that his wife Amestris was a cold and vindictive queen. And that would be Esther, of course. And to an outsider, it's understandable that she would appear vindictive and cold. After all, she stepped in and put an end to Haman's evil activities, and she was also able to save her people from their enemies at that particular time. There are people who feel that it was brutal and cruel for the court of law at Nuremberg, Germany, to sentence many of Hitler's henchmen to prison. But those henchmen were rascals of the first order. Their treatment of the Jews in concentration camps was absolutely inhumane. The genocide of 6 million Jews. Well, if Haman had got his way, they'd have murdered 15 million Jews in Persia. To many people on the outside, it didn't look as though Hitler's men should be treated with such harshness. But those who knew the inside story knew that they got justice. Let's look at verses 3 and 4. And all the rulers of the provinces and the lieutenants and the deputies and officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. Now Mordecai the Jew is by the side of the king. Haman, who would have put the Jews to death, is gone. The very throne that had once condemned the Jews now protects them. The very throne of God protects us today. The Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 8, verse 33 and 34, who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It is God that justifieth. Now, you know, you can go for many years in a Baptist church, and very rarely does anybody bring up the subject of elect or election. But I looked in a concordance this afternoon, and I found the word elect is used 17 times in the Bible, and the word election is used 6 times in the New Testament alone. Let's look at verse 34. Romans 8, 33 and 34. Who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It is God that justifieth. Who is he that condemneth? It is Christ that died, yea, rather, that is risen again, and who is even at the right hand of God, who also maketh intercession for us. Now notice how God justifies. First, Christ died. He's risen again. He's even at the right hand of God, and he also makes intercession for us. These are the reasons no one can condemn a believer. How wonderful this is. He knows exactly how you feel, and he knows exactly how I feel. And in that position, he is interceding for us. Things have changed for saved sinners. When I was a teenager, they had a shortage of teachers in Vacation Bible School, and so my dad had me teach the junior boys in Vacation Bible School. And every year, from juniors up, we used a little book Brother Clarence Walker had written, and we used that for Vacation Bible School. And it was called Saved Sinners and Lost Sinners. I don't know if you ever saw that little pamphlet or not. Saved sinners and lost sinners. There's 2 kinds of sinners, you know, because all of us are sinners. And even after we're saved, we've got that old man, the flesh, and it wants to sin more often than not. So if you're a saved sinner, but you're still a sinner till you get your new body. When Jesus comes and we get our new body when we're resurrected. This old body is resurrected from the grave, and that spirit of ours that's been in heaven meets up with that new body as he's resurrected. Times have changed now for saved sinners. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14 through 16. Seeing then that we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession. For we have not an high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. I have a Savior who is despised by the world. A lot of dirty, blasphemous things are being said about him. But my friends, he is the man in glory. He is the King of kings. He's the Lord of hosts and the Lord of lords. He is the lily of the valley. He's the one altogether lovely. He is the Christ among 10,000, the chief among 10,000. And someday he's coming again. We ought to get in practice bending our knees to him, adoring and praising him. That's very important. He should become sweeter to us with each passing day. In fact, there's a song entitled Sweeter as the Days Go By. You remember that song? I was in a quartet and we used to sing. That was our favorite song. That's the way it should be for each one of us. Do you rejoice more as a Christian today than you did a year ago or 10 years ago? And not only do we have the dawn of change, but we have the triumph of the Jews. We find that in the 5th through the 16th verse. Let's start with verse 5 through 10. That the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. And in Shushan the palace the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men. Now then it gives you 10 names. And most people can't pronounce those names, and there's a few of them I have a hard time pronouncing, but you know who those names are? There's 10 names. They're the 10 sons of Haman, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, and they slew them. But on the spoil laid not their hand. The Jews struck down all the enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them. Although the Jews took offensive action, they did so from a defensive necessity. If they hadn't done it, they would have been destroyed by the same people. Entire groups and nationalities within the Persian Empire were committed to their destruction, and their desires had been sanctioned by royal decree. The report that in the city of Susa or Susan, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men shows how deeply the anti-Semitic hatred had penetrated. The Jews also killed 10 sons of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Haman had always been identified as an enemy. Perhaps it stands to reason that his sons would align themselves against the people whom their father hated. Their hatred toward the Jews probably deepened when they lost their home and inheritance to Esther and Mordecai. Their deaths also abolished the lineage of Haman. Although the ordinance allowed it, the Jews did not lay their hands on the plunder. Verse 11 and 12. On that day, the number of those that were slain in Shushan, the palace, was brought before the king. And the king said unto Esther the queen, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the palace, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the kingdom's provinces? Now, what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee, for what is thy request further? And it shall be done. So on the same day that the violence occurred, 13th day of December, the body count from the palace of Shushan was reported to the king. And in response, Xerxes passed the information on to Queen Esther, telling her of the destruction of 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman. He never evinced much concern over the lives of people. The king's next question to Esther, what have they done in the rest of the king's provinces, suggests a detached interest. I think he would have already known that. He also asked, what is your future request? It will also be granted. His statement reflected a willingness to continue the killing. Look at verses 13 and 14. Then said Esther, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow also according unto this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. Now, they're already dead. So in addition to being killed, the next day she wants to hang them on the gallows. And the king commanded it so to be done. And the decree was given at Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. Esther requested a second day of attack. Give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also. Esther's request seems to assume a Jewish offensive, not a self-protective stance. But the purpose of the author of the book of Esther was not to explain strategies or motives. His point in describing the fighting was to explain the celebration of Purim. And to that end, the second day of fighting in Susa needed to be mentioned. Esther also requested that Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. The public display of a body needed an imperial edict. Hanging Haman's sons was a method of public disgrace and sent a strong message of power, especially to any who might question Esther or the Jews' authority and rising dominance. It's most likely that the rubbing out of Haman's family precluded any more problems of this family. As noted in the beginning of the study of the book of Esther, had Joshua and the 12 tribes of Israel destroyed the Amalekites as commanded by Moses in Deuteronomy 25:19, the Jews would not have had genocide planned against them in Esther's day. Again, had King Saul followed God's instructions by Samuel, King Agag and his descendants would have been destroyed, and the problem would have been solved that way. 1 Samuel 15:23. So here's two instances when the jeopardy of the birth of Christ could have been prevented if God's people had been obedient. And then we come to the providence of God. Yes, they were obligated to do what they were told to do, but they didn't do it, and they paid for it. They were told to wipe out all of the people of the land that God had given them, but they didn't do it. They did most of it, but they left some. And they paid for it through the centuries. But regardless of the fact that Joshua fell down on the job, regardless of the fact that King Saul fell down on the job and he paid for it, God still brought forth his son from a Virgin Mary. So the king commanded that this was to be done. Just as Esther had asked, so it was accomplished. This may indicate the queen's growing power. Look at the 15th and 16th verses. For the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month Adar, and slew 300 men at Shushan. But on the prey they laid not their hand. But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together, and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and slew their foes 70 and 5,000. But they laid not their hands on the prey. So as they done on the second day, the 13th, so the Jews did on the 14th. The Jews in Susa came together, and they put to death in Susa 300 men. Away from the fighting in Susa, the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves. These violent exchanges were not hate-inspired retaliation, but attempted relief. They were defending themselves. The emphasis throughout is rest, freedom from danger and fear. So the report that they killed 75,000 enemies was not to gloat in numbers, but to admit to the widespread anti-Jewish sentiment that existed throughout the Persian Empire. The author of the book of Esther reminds his readers that they did not lay their hands on the plunder. The objective was relief, not gain. And after the dawn of change and the triumph, there came the rest. Verses 17 and 18. On the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day of the same, rested they, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews that were in Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 14th thereof, and on the 15th day of the same, they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. So in the provinces, on the 14th day of Adar, the Jews rested and made a day of feasting and joy. But while their country relatives feasted, the Jews in Susa were fighting. Consequently, the Jews in the capital rested on the 15th and made it a day of feasting and joy. Verse 19. Therefore the Jews of the villages that dwelt in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of gladness and feasting and a good day, and of sending portions one to another. The author of Esther interjects a parenthesis to explain why rural Jews, more correctly those living outside the capital, observed the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents, while those living in Susa celebrated on the 15th. He provided the historical explanation for a contemporary practice. So first we have the deliverance of the Jews, and now we have the festival of Purim instituted. Those we'll cover in the last 12 verses, 13 verses of the chapter. We come to Mordecai's letter. It begins at verse 20 through 22. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both nigh and far, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and the 15th day of the same yearly, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning unto a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. Many people have asked the question, who wrote the book of Esther? I believe this passage gives at least a suggestion that Mordecai was the author, and I think most conservative theologians believe that he was. The holiday was to become a great remembrance party because their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. Earlier they had been weeping and wailing, Esther chapter 4, verse 3, but now everything's changed. So Mordecai wrote that their celebrations were to reflect the great reversal. Instead of fasting and sorrow, there would be days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Verse 23, and the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written unto them. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written. And the people bound themselves to the annual festivities to continue not only the manner of celebration, but the different dates. Now verses 24 and 25. Because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast Pur, P-U-R, that is, the lot, to consume them. He cast a lot to determine what day was the best from the soothsayers to destroy the Jews. And of course, it found out that the soothsayers, just like they always do, don't know what they're doing. But then Esther came before the king. He commanded by letters that this wicked device which he devised against the Jews should return upon his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Again, we see the silent, moving hand of God protecting his people. I don't know of another passage in the Bible which has greater irony in that Haman and his sons are hanged on the same gallows built for Mordecai. Which brings us to the Feast of Purim, verses 26 through 29. Beginning in verse 26, wherefore they call these days Purim after the name of Pur. Therefore, for all the words of this letter, of that which they had seen concerning this matter, and which had come unto them. The Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, so as it should not fail, that they would keep these 2 days according to their writings and according to their appointed time every year, and that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, and that these days of Purim should not fail among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. Once again, the author of Esther inserted a parenthesis this time to explain that the days were called Purim from the word of pure or pur, Mordecai's or chance, roll of the dice. Mordecai's instructions, combined with the community's experience from the hatching of Haman's plot to the final deliverance, convinced the Jews to bind themselves to the custom that they and their descendants should without fail observe these 2 days every year. The language gives it the same force as irrevocable Persian law. Purim is still celebrated by the Jewish community today. It's one of their greatest festivals every year. And now we come to Queen Esther's letter. Verse 29, Then Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, wrote with all authority to confirm this second letter of Purim. Queen Esther issued a letter after Mordecai's letter, in which she confirmed all that he had written. She brought the full force of her authority as queen of Persia and as a daughter of Abihail in making Purim binding. Verse 30 through 31. And he sent the letters unto all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim in their times appointed, according as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had enjoined them, and as they had decreed for themselves and for their seed the matter of the fastings and of their cry. This designation of provinces underscores the far reach of Jewish dispersion. It also suggests the royal nature of the letters. The queen, in establishing the days of Purim, did so gently but firmly, with goodwill and assurance to all her people. Now, verse 32, And the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, that it was written in the book. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records. The decree, the letters, and the will of the people converged in this obligatory matter, this obligatory holiday. It was also written in the official Persian records because the imperial government demonstrated interest in the observance of religious and ethnic holidays. And finally, we have the epilogue of Mordecai, which is the 10th chapter. Only got 3 verses here. I start with Esther chapter 10, verse 1 and 2. And the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea. That means the coastline all around. And all the acts of his power and of his might, and the declarations of the greatness of Mordecai whereunto the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia? So we have, it appears, an odd insertion. King Xerxes imposed tribute through all the empire to its distant shores. The purpose, however, was to complement Mordecai's position in the kingdom. The king could only impose taxes upon those whom he ruled. So it is one way of describing him again, the vast extent of Xerxes' empire. He controlled the entire realm, even to its distant western shores and islands of the Mediterranean Sea. The king was also complimented by attributing to him acts of power and might. But the real point of these descriptions was the greatness of Mordecai, a respectable Jew. Mordecai was favored by Xerxes. He's the king's new prime minister. The author of the book of Esther appealed to history to validate his story and his claims. The book of the Annals of the Kings of Media and Persia the Chronicles of the Persian Empire. Verse 3, For Mordecai the Jew was next unto the king Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed. Mordecai lived out a rags to riches story. He started as an unknown employee of the imperial workforce in Susa, and ended up as a trusted and powerful ruler alongside the king, respected and admired by his countrymen. Mordecai was venerated because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. He was loyal to the Jewish people, and through God's providence wielded great influence. The Jews had an advocate at the highest reaches of political power. Now I'd like to close with a cooking lesson. Tom's wife decided to cook his favorite meal, a beef roast. Now he was puzzled when she took the meat and cut a chunk off each end and placed it in the roaster. And when he asked her about it, she replied, "My mother always did it that way." So one afternoon, Steve's mother-in-law was visiting, so he asked her, "Why is it important to cut off the ends of the beef roast before cooking it?" "Well, it's a family secret," she said. "The meat always turns out very tender. I learned it from my mother." The next day, Steve called his wife's grandmother. "We're trying to unravel a mystery," he said. "Why is it you cut off the ends of a beef roast before cooking it?" "Well, it's the only way I can get the thing to fit in my roaster." Often what starts as a meaningful and necessary action becomes a pointless custom over time. As the memory fades, only the rituals remain. In order to assure the tradition of Purim as well as its meaning within the Jewish community, the violent days preceding the feast were recorded, and the edicts from Mordecai and Esther were established. The celebration gained depth when seen in the context of the turbulent events initiated by Haman's edict against the Jews. It gained purpose when viewed as the historical peace from the Jews' enemy. The remembrance of Purim gave hope of God's deliverance to future generations. And as a result, this festival is still the most jubilant celebration within the Jewish religious year. Next Sunday evening, we'll continue preaching through the Bible with the book of Job. The book of Job is the first of the poetic books of the Bible. So I look forward to taking you through Job. And very few people have ever read more than just a few chapters in the book of Job. They'll read the first couple, 3 chapters, and they'll read over in the middle of the book, and then they'll finish the last chapter, and that's about all they get to. I had a professor at Lexington Baptist College, when he was at Georgetown College, which was a preacher's school at that time, it was kind of phasing into liberal arts, but a Southern Baptist preacher's college originally just outside of Lexington, Kentucky, in Georgetown. And he was a student there, and he got a job during the summer at a play, an outdoor rendition of the book of Job. And it's still done today. It's a beautiful backdrop with a pool in front and these figures that represent the characters in the book of Job behind that, and a big limestone cliff behind that, and all kinds of lights coming down. It's beautiful. I've seen it a couple of times. But anyhow, he had memorized the book of Job. He was one of the characters in the play, and it was interesting. His name was Johnny Thompson. He's one of the best Bible history teachers I've ever had in my life. The best I've ever heard. And anyway, the book of Job is going to be a fascinating experience because we're not going to just cover 3 or 4 chapters. We're going through every chapter in the book. We'll be in there probably a year, but the book of Job is a fascinating book that most people don't take the opportunity to really learn about. So that's our message tonight. Steve, would you close us in a word of prayer?